Hello. In a dramatic escalation of tensions in the Middle East, a US airstrike has killed Iran's most important military commander. General Qasem Soleimani was the commander of the Quds Force of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards. They are responsible for Iranian foreign military operations and answer directly to the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iran has declared 3 days of national mourning and promised harsh vengeance.
Celebrations in Syria as President Assad's critics express joy over their enemy's death. And extreme caution in Israel, which deployed tanks to the Golan Heights bordering Syria, while UN peacekeepers beefed up patrols between Israel and Lebanon. 3,500 more U.S. troops are being ordered to the region from Fort Bragg, the rest of the Global Response Force, continuing the buildup in Kuwait and potentially Baghdad. Around the world, U.S. embassies are on high alert, starting in Baghdad following the siege that helped trigger the targeted killing of the Iranian commander. Here at home, police are on heightened vigilance at what they call sensitive areas and critical structures.
We are now potentially facing a threat that's different and greater than anything we have faced previously.
So a couple of days ago, I ignorantly had no idea why my kids were asking me about something, but they randomly started asking me about the draft.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Yes, they asked me about the draft, and I got all nerdy, and I pulled out my selective service card from my wallet. You remember this, Ron?
I don't remember ever having one.
Like when you turn 18?
Sign up. I remember signing up.
But you have to.
Yeah, I went to the post office. I wore a red and blue striped shirt with white pants.
No, you didn't.
Yes, I did. I was all American. Yeah, white painter pants. They were cool.
But it's this idea that you're registered for the potential of there being a draft when
Right.
you turn 18 as a man in America. So I've got my card. My dad told me to keep it in my wallet, so I did all these years, which is super nerdy. But I didn't think of why they asked me about this. Your kids asked you about a draft.
Yeah, I could tell you why they asked. Because my kids asked me the same thing and were like, Mommy, could we still be called like on is a draft? Could that still happen? And I wondered too. And I asked them why, what's going on? They were like, hashtag World War III is trending on Snapchat. And I was like, what?
You're not on Snapchat.
I actually found out about some of the latest developments because of that conversation. So they're
Really?
like keeping me up to date on international relationships.
Now, when Ron and I are on Snapchat, it's with young kids, and we're doing the puppy dog face.
Really?
Right, Ron? Is that what you're doing on Snapchat?
Oh, I spent a lot of time on Snapchat.
But now, in all seriousness, your age demographic, Ron, you are not of age to be drafted for Vietnam.
No, I think 70, 72 was the last draft.
Yeah, my dad was drafted.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't volunteer. His number was low enough. He was like 82, I think was his number for his birthday in the draft, and he got drafted for Vietnam. So when my kids asked, we made it about my dad being drafted.
Oh, yeah.
And they weren't that interested. And now in hindsight, I realize why, because they actually wonder whether they would be drafted because of what's going on in Iran right now.
Yes.
And I don't know how, but I didn't recognize the gravity of the whole thing until I think last night, which when you're listening to this, the last night I'm referring to was when I'm just sitting there minding my own business on the couch, realizing there's a special report on television, and it's that Iran had sent multiple surface-to-surface missiles into Iraq,
Yeah.
and a number of them actually hit an area in Iraq where U.S. troops were.
Breaking news. Tonight, Iran keeping their promise to retaliate, launching 15 ballistic missiles at 2 military bases in Iraq that house American troops.
Which is why the hashtag World War III was going.
Right.
So what did you tell your kids? Don't worry about it, or what?
It brought up the conversation about Iran. Len came in and was kind of trying to calm them down because there's fear even in that circle of Gen Zs. But as things have developed days into it, there is that conversation of what could possibly happen. But you know what, though, to be honest, as a parent, a lot of it is like, we don't know. But you don't want to show that to your kids. Oh,
Right.
And I also don't want to tell the kids that historically wars have started over less.
yeah.
I mean, World War I was sparked by an assassination of the Archduke.
Prince Ferdinand.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that being the case, remember, United States, whether or not it was justified, that's for you to decide. I'm not going to get into that here, but we assassinated an Iranian general when he was in Iraq. Wars have started over less. And in World War II, economic pressures and sanctions on Japan ended up in some respects, being some of the catalyst for Pearl Harbor. So wars have started with less.
But even as a parent, though, wars have started with less. You don't want to tell them that. You don't want to scare them.
Right.
But then it's hard with kids today being exposed to media even before you are, which is my situation now. You don't know where to turn because we all know different outlets will make things sound more urgent or worse than it really is. So I was actually encouraged within Christian circles, trusted individuals talking about it to help empower us to know better, maybe, but even how to communicate it to kids in a way that's more reasonable.
Well, and Ron, with your life experience being more extensive than ours, would you like how I put that?
Oh, yeah, Sonny.
Are you nervous about World War III, or do you hear that and you just scoff at it?
Yeah, at this point, I'm more on the scoff end than being nervous. I'm concerned the potential is there, but that potential has been going on in that region with us for 20 years or more. Even before that, when the Ayatollah took over and that whole revolution, they had 100 or so of our people held hostage in the embassy for 444 days.
Yeah.
And
so you've seen way worse.
Yeah.
I mean, that is way worse. Americans held hostage. What do we make of all this? Well, praise the Lord, providentially, we had scheduled on our live show an interview with Dr. Glenn Dewar. Mm-hmm. He's a professor of international studies at Cedarville University, and he is an expert in this area. And we learned some things about him in that conversation. I had no idea the level of his experience and expertise in this. So how close are we to World War III? Well, we did an interview live on the show to try to find out, and here it is.
You know what we're about to do? We're about to get real. We're about to have conversations that Christians have behind closed doors, the scary ones, the ones that make you feel uncomfortable. That's where we're going. Why? Because we're family. Ustedes son mi familia.
So this is the Brian and Janelle podcast. She's Janelle, and I'm Brian. If you don't want to miss anything, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button to get a notification whenever we drop a new episode. This is the Brian and Janelle podcast. I'm so glad he's with us today. It's truly providential. Dr. Glenn Dewar, Assistant Professor of International Studies at Cedarville University. So much to talk about. Good morning, sir. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Boy, I was sitting there last night, minding my own business, trying to listen to my wife, and I saw news alerts coming about missiles from Iran to Iraq. But before we get to that, let's back up a few steps here to the current tension. Help us understand who the Iranian general was that we took out a couple of days ago.
Sure. Qasem Soleimani was 62 years old, from a fairly poor background. He grew up in a city called Kerman, which is in towards the southeast of Iran, and basically made his way up through the military ranks, gaining significant praise for his actions in the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, and then moved his way up to become a general in the Iranian military, and basically someone who became very close to the current Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. He was instrumental in guiding Shia proxies in Iraq, especially with the Iraq War with the United States. He basically became the godfather, for lack of a better term, of the IED, improvised explosive device, which was so catastrophic to many Americans and coalition forces in Iraq, especially in the 2000s. And then he really expanded elsewhere as Iran's expansionist tendencies grew. If we think about the Houthi rebels in Yemen, for example, or in Syria, or even with Hezbollah factions in southern Lebanon that so frequently target or at least intimidate Israel. And so in all of those areas, he became kind of the trusted general of the Ayatollah. So that's his kind of background.
And then I think to better understand his level of influence in society, can you help us with some kind of parallel in our culture? Who would be a similar person to be targeted by a foreign country for us to understand his level of influence in Iranian culture?
A number of analysts say that he was really the number two person. And so it might be like attacking the Secretary of Defense, for example, or even the Secretary of State at that level. I tend to put him somewhere between the number 5 and number 10 most influential person in Iran. I didn't quite see him as quite as high as that. But if you're taking him as the number 2, it's the vice president or, the head of the military or something like that in terms of his significance.
So why would the U.S. target him?
The U.S. and the British actually had previous opportunities to hit him, but opted not to do so, arguing that it would be too big of a response from Iran. The big question with that is, well, when someone is on par with an Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of ISIS, why wouldn't you try and neutralize that type of threat? The difference being is that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are non-state actors, Iran is a country. But to go back to my previous answer, Soleimani directly orchestrated a number of IED attacks that were sort of devastating on our Marine Corps, for example, in Iraq in the 2000s. He has a long track record of actually orchestrating these terrorist attacks on U.S. and coalition troops.
And I know that there's a difference of opinions in terms of his level in the government, but taking someone like him out, is it the equivalent of an act of war?
That's the really difficult part of international relations, is that international law is fairly new, and it's changing significantly with technology. So what do you do with a situation like that? Javad Zarif, who is the foreign affairs minister of Iran, basically called it an assassination, that Soleimani was in Baghdad for diplomatic reasons. Our Secretary of State in the United States, Mike Pompeo, basically laughed at that, saying, he's never been on these diplomatic journeys. There was no visa that came with it. He was directly there. We have intelligence from the Department of Defense saying that, look, they were aligning for an attack. And so in terms of what this looks like militarily and diplomatically, this is clearly an attack. The question is whether it's an act of war. Iran will say yes. The United States will say no. Look, we were acting in our own self-defense, trying to protect our troops. You can argue this from the UN Charter, for example. And so all of a sudden, Article 51 of the UN Charter has become this big battleground under international law, with both the United States and Iran claiming it for both of the actions. That is, the neutralization of Soleimani, but then also Iran's retaliation with the 15 cruise missiles that they fired at U.S. troops and coalition troops at bases in Iraq yesterday.
As I look at this, the way you describe it, there's absolutely no question about the fact that he was responsible for the death of many American troops. So our response in his assassination was not unprovoked. It was actually provoked. It was a retaliation. But now last night we have the Iranians, who say it's an act of war, responding in significant measure by sending a ton of missiles into Iraq. So now what's next?
I mean, the good news about this is that it can de-escalate, because no U.S. troops, at least as we know so far, were killed or injured. Iran acted in a way where they can say to their nationalists that were mourning Soleimani's death, look, we acted aggressively against the United States. We avenged his death. What we know is that there were 15 cruise missiles. CENTCOM reported that, 10 of which were aimed at Ain al-Assad base, which is in Anbar province in the west of Iraq. It's a very sparsely populated area. And then another 5 cruise missiles hit the base in Erbil in the north, which is a Kurdish area. So the United States can say, okay, well, the Iranians have blown off steam. Now the United States can work with allies, especially through our Swiss intermediary, diplomatically to Iran, to basically de-escalate this situation. So the good news is it could de-escalate fairly quickly. The bad news is, as you intimated in an earlier segment, wars have started over less.
Yes.
I don't see that happening. I think that this is going to calm down ultimately. It was more of an escalation last night than I thought would take place. I thought Iran would retaliate through a proxy or through some form of cyber attack, something like that. It was more than I expected. This was the first projectile to come from Iranian territory since the Iran-Iraq war that ended in the late 80s. So it's a big escalation, but I don't think that anything has to go from here.
So jumping on that, we're in a season where it's difficult to know what outlet to trust in terms of news. So since we have you here and we trusting you, some of the things I'm seeing trending are things like, especially in younger circles like Gen Zs, is hashtag World War III, or even older people are like nervous because Iran is just, based on history, scary. And then you hear words like nuclear weapons come up. What would you tell people that are just nervous?
I would say calm down. This is a dangerous moment, but we've certainly seen more dangerous moments. All of us talked in 2017 when North Korea, for example, was test firing intercontinental ballistic missiles. I thought that was more dangerous than this. Here's the reason why. Neither the United States nor Iran want war with one another. The United States, if they were to go into Iran, would face a theater that was basically Afghanistan on steroids. Iran's population is 4 times larger, around 80 million. There are 2 massive mountain ranges that run through Iran that are very difficult to navigate. And Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, but it does have 130 nuclear-related sites. Think about trying to safeguard all of those. Iran's economy has been hit hard since sanctions were put in place again in 2017, and Iran has no appetite for some kind of conflict with the United States. They look around them to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they want no part of that. And so I think neither side wants a war here, and I think they're looking for an exit ramp. If we think of a highway, they want to get off of it whilst appeasing strong voices within each country. And I think we're at a state where right now where that could occur. Whether or not the leaders do that is another thing, but there is an opportunity to cool things down right now and to avoid conflict.
Now, couldn't an equal argument be made about the economic pressures that have been building on Iran over the last number of years could give them almost no choice but to lash out? I think that happened with Japan, didn't it, in World War II?
Yeah, that's part of it, and it's an interesting one because Iran's economy has contracted some 4 to 6% in each of the last 3 years. But having said that, Iran will, basically the worst thing that can happen to your country is a war. So the economy could get an awful lot worse. The other thing that most people overlook is that Iran's regime is much more fragile than we think. Iran is not monolithic. It's roughly 2/3 of the population are ethnic Persians, and there's a significant number of people that are anti-regime. If we think of the Green Revolution in 2009, that really rocked the regime, and then there were protests a couple years ago that were pretty similar in that type of strength. There are a lot of people within Iran that want to see change. Plus, Iran's population, 30%, is under the age of 30. They have very different and new ideas. They want change. They want things done differently. And so the Iranian regime could lash out. It could do something, but they do threaten to be toppled by doing something like that because there are just so many factions within the country that are unhappy with the state of things right now. So I think they're looking for basically continuation. How can the regime continue? How can it muddle along? How can they maintain power? And going to war with the United States would be a clear way that they would be removed.
Which direction are these actions pressing that 1/3 of the Iranian population that tends toward to be anti-regime? Is this pressing them towards sympathy with the United States, or is it getting them more cozy with the regime?
I would argue that the number is much greater than that. That's the 1/3 is actually people that are non-Persians. So they're Arabs, they're Azeris, they're Balokis, they're Turkmen. They're different people that are Sunni that really dislike the Shia, especially the 12 Shia that are in power. Plus, if we go back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, we can look at it and say, well, it was an Islamist overthrow. But in the protests leading up to that, there were communists, there were Western democratic sympathizers. It happened to be that the Islamists won out in all of that. But there are a lot of people, and I would venture that the number is somewhere between 60, if not 75% of the population, that is very reticent about how they're being governed. So I think the regime is much more fragile than we think. They're very good at keeping power. These are very smart people. But at the same time, they're very careful not to cross lines. And I think what they did last night is really just kind of stepped up to it as maximum as they could, because Soleimani was such an important character in Iran. But at the same time, I think they're trying to draw back and not get the ire of the United States.
Now, I can tell from public opinion here that nobody would want, not many people at least, would want to rush into any kind of war. But what about public opinion in Iran in the midst of the economic struggle? How are they responding to what's been happening?
There are different forces, and there are a lot of proud people that will back a nationalist claim. And I think that's what the regime is trying to do right now. It's trying to say, look, we were hit by the Americans. Let's rally around our flag. Let's rally around our culture and try to do something. And there is a bump that occurs with things like that. But if you go back to the day-to-day running of the country, the way things look, there's a challenge within Iran. I've actually been interviewed several times in the Iranian media. And what's interesting about that is that they never actually censored my comments. And that struck me as really interesting because I said, well, this is a theocratic, authoritarian government. Don't they tend to do this a lot? And what occurred to me is that I was always interviewed by someone younger, someone more reform-minded, and I think that is telling to me that there are a lot of people, even within the regime, even within the country, that have decent jobs that kind of go along to get along, but at the same time, they know that their country is backwards in the sense that they don't have human rights, that they don't have the ability to speak freely. And so reaching out to Westerners and allowing them to speak is actually a mode of slowly pushing back against the government. And I think we see that a fair bit, especially amongst the younger people in Iran.
Really insightful, helpful comments there. Dr. Glenn Dewar is Assistant Professor of International Studies at Cedarville. Before we say goodbye, how do you recommend we pray in the midst of this current international crisis? I
would pray for cooler heads to prevail, for wisdom and guidance. We're called to pray for our leaders. I think that there's a lot there. It's like I said, it's a dangerous moment. We've had more dangerous moments in recent years, but it's not one that we can turn a blind eye. And that there's a thorough negotiation, that people really investigate to make sure we know exactly what happened rather than jumping to conclusions. I think all of those areas are very, very important in terms of prayer.
Thanks again, Doc.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, hold up. Where are you going? You know you liked your time with us. You want more. So look down, hit that button right there, subscribe, and you'll get updated episodes, and then you can hang some more.
And guess what? You can help us. How? A 5-star rating.
You can also hang with us live, weekdays 6 to 9 a.m., interact with us, talk with us, download the Moody Radio app.
Or at brianandjanelle.org.
And we don't put all this together all by ourselves. There's some great people behind all this production. We want to thank Ron Eastwood, Kelly Ryder, Paul Carter, Doug Hayner, Mike Reynolds, and our awesome and fearless leader, Josue Villa.
And finally, this podcast is a production of Moody Radio in Cleveland, a ministry of Moody Bible Institute.
Well, Brian, that's a wrap.
Yep.